Juggling all those adjective endings is tricky, isn't it? All those E's and ERs, ES's, ENs, especially when you've got the dative on one hand and you're trying to keep all those tricky endings in the air with the other. Well, today I'm going to show you how to keep the dative under control without dropping the ball. Grüß Gott, hallo, ich bin Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 2. Herzlich willkommen. Well, it's almost as if the Germans realized when they'd finished inventing the dative that they'd made it just a little bit tricky. So they dialed it back a bit with the adjectives, because adjectives in the dative are perhaps easier than you think. Of course, we need to know when we're meant to be using the dative, and if you've watched our videos on the dative, and we've got a couple of them, you'll know. But if you can't be bothered checking them out, well, fair enough. Let's have a quick refresher. We use it, of course, for indirect objects, like ich mache euch ein Video. A small group of special verbs, das Video gefällt mir. Some reflexive verbs that have a definite object, ich zieh mir eine Jacke an, for describing locations. And of course these locations can be locations in time as well as locations in space. So saying, for example, where you are or where something is. Wir sind in der Straßenbahn. Or when something happens, das machen wir am Wochenende. We use it for objects of some of those pesky prepositions. Ich war mit meiner Frau in Österreich. We use it for the personal dative along with some adjectives to help us express perceptions. Mir ist oft kalt. And there are quite a few idiomatic phrases that use the dative too. Der Zug hatte Verspätung. Das war uns egal. Oh, and we use it when we can't be bothered using the genitive. Trotz dem wilden Wetter konnten wir gut wandern. So you'll be using it quite a bit. And as we know, cases affect articles, adjectives and pronouns. But we've looked at the articles and pronouns in other videos. So let's concentrate now on how the adjectives behave. If you watched our last video, then you'll know we often talk about typical endings. In the subject case, these typical endings are hinted at nicely by the definite articles. So if you see an ER somewhere, the noun it precedes will probably be masculine. If you see an E, there's a good chance it's feminine. And that S is typical for the neuter. And you'll remember that we made the very important point. If the typical ending is on the article, it won't be on the adjective. And if it's not on the article, it'll have to be on the adjective. So this gave us sentences like these. Das ist das blaue Boot and das ist ein blaues Boot. In the first sentence, the article has the typical ending, so the adjective doesn't. And in the second sentence, it's round the other way. The article doesn't, so the adjective does. But in the dative, things get simplified. In the dative, it doesn't really matter whether we're using the definite articles, the indefinite articles, the possessive articles, or even kein, our word for negating nouns. We use the same typical endings. All we do is make the distinction between feminine on the one hand or not feminine on the other. And it's always the case, as you can see from these examples. Wir sind gern auf dem Markt. Hier sind wir in einer Straßenbahn. Ich mache meiner Frau einen Kaffee. Der Kutter liegt im Hafen. Or zu einer Torte trinkt man Kaffee. So we only have two endings. Okay, so now we know our typical endings, we come to the easy bit. If you're using an article of any kind, then your adjectives always get an EN ending. Always. Check out these examples. Hier fahren wir mit dem alten Zug. Nach dem langen Flug waren wir müde. Wir haben unsere kleinen Tochter einen Kuchen gebacken. Hier sitze ich vor einem offenen Fenster. Christine geht mit ihrem alten Hund spazieren. Zu der leckeren Torte trinken sie Kaffee. So that at least is fairly straightforward. All of our adjectives just have that en ending. And you remember what I said last time. If there's no article, then the adjective needs to have the typical endings. Again, er if the thing is feminine, otherwise we use that typical ending em. Here are some examples. Bei schönem Wetter sitzen wir draußen. Mit lauter Musik kann nichts anfangen. Die Krawatte ist aus reiner Seide. In each case you can see which nouns are feminine and which aren't. Here, silk and music are clearly feminine because of those nice er endings, and the weather isn't. This really only leaves us now with the plural, which in the dative is pretty straightforward. You'll remember, of course, that the articles in the plural always have that en ending, and there's always a nice n ending on the end of the noun too. Well, the adjectives just get the same endings, so that there is an en ending on everything in the dative plural. Here are some examples. Christina geht mit ihren alten Hunden spazieren. An diesen kleinen Booten gefällt es mir, dass sie so bunt sind. In den kleinen Geschäften findet man oft schönere Sachen. And so that's pretty much all there is to it. The dative has a much simpler system when it comes to articles and adjectives. If we're only using articles, you'll only ever have to use that en ending on your adjectives, and the dative plural will only ever use an en too. You'll have to be a little bit more careful if we're not using an article, but you know your typical endings. Er for feminine, em for everything that's not. Und so, meine Lieben, ich hoffe, das Video hat euch gefallen und ein bisschen geholfen. Das war es dann für heute und auch für dieses Video. Danke fürs Zuschauen, alles Gute, auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.